Hello and welcome to this special show. As the world grapples with two wars, the Russia-Ukraine war and the Israel-Hamas war, the role of China is being watched closely. Over the last few decades, the West has seen China as a key supply chain partner which can manufacture cheaply and at scale, but at the same time also try to check the economic and political influence of China. Taiwan remains a cause for worry, as experts believe this could be the next flashpoint in geopolitics. India has itself had tense relations with China since the time we recognized the new communist government in 1949. After wars in 1962, conflicts in 1967, India and China had serious clashes in 2020 in Galwan. Since then, while both sides have disengaged, tensions remain high and both sides are at their highest level of military preparedness in the Ladakh region. Now, a book by India's former Foreign Secretary and former Ambassador to China, Vijay Gokhale, looks at the history of Western relations with China and India's role through the decades. The book, called Crosswinds, covers 4 specific events in geopolitics. Firstly, the question of recognition of the new communist government of China in 1949, the diplomatic resolution of the Indo-China crisis at Geneva Conference in 1954, and the 2 Taiwan Strait crises in 1954 and 1955. To discuss that and the lessons which are very relevant even today in the context of China is Ambassador Vijay Gokhale in our studios. Ambassador Gokhale, thank you very much for joining us. You begin your book by talking about the post-Second World War scenario when countries were looking at the rise of China, looking at changing political developments and seeing how they can contain the rise of this country. Do you think there are lessons there relevant even today in the current context?
Parikshit, first of all, thank you for inviting me on your program. The establishment of a communist government in China in 1949 was a very major development in the Indo-Pacific. For the first time, you had a communist government in Asia. And the United States, which was the paramount power after the Second World War, was concerned that communism would spread to other parts of the region, including Southeast Asia and South Asia. So to that degree, it was of concern to the United States on how the other major Asian country would react to this development. And of course, that country was India. We had just become independent. We were finding our feet. And we were faced with a very unusual set of circumstances because there was not only a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, but you also had a new government in China of which we really knew nothing. Now, of course, things have changed over the period of 70-odd years. The United States is not so predominant as it was in 1949 or 1950. China is much more powerful. There is no doubt that India itself has become stronger with much greater interest. So things have changed. But there are certain features which are constant. The hotspots remain: Korea, Taiwan, the South China Sea. What also remains is that Sino-US relations today have come back to what they were in the 1950s, into a mode of confrontation. There is also the continued uncertainty in the India-China relationship. We tried to find a path in the 1950s. We are still trying to find a path today. So I think we need to be careful about history. It doesn't necessarily repeat itself. But I think lessons from history do help in crafting foreign policy today, or at least avoiding some of the pitfalls.
Right. Just to ask you about India's approach, and interestingly, when you've looked at the post-Second World War scenario and how China has been seen ever since, India was important then in how the world approaches or wants to talk with China, and India is important even now. Do you think Jawaharlal Nehru and the government of that time, by rushing to recognize a new communist government without specific guarantees on the boundary question, on Tibet, on other important agreements between India and China, made a mistake because of which we somehow are paying even today?
Well, let me begin, Parikshit, by saying that the strategic vision that our first Prime Minister had, which is that if we have to build an Asian order by Asians and for Asians, we need Asian partners, and China is the crucial partner we need, was broadly a vision that should be endorsed. What happened, however, was that we were not clear what our objective was in dealing with this new government of which we had no knowledge. In those circumstances, there were two other major powers, both allies, the United States and Great Britain, but with fundamentally different interests on China. The United States wanted to prevent the spread of communism. It was a geostrategic objective. But Britain wanted to keep its empire, its colony in Hong Kong, its huge trading rights in China, and its colonies in Southeast Asia. And so a gulf opened up between the two of them. And what India discovered was it was being pulled in two different directions. Now, in these circumstances, because it was felt that it was strategically important to establish good relations with China in order to build an Asian order, the US position did not therefore appeal to us, which was understandable. But then the question that arose is, did we have any particular objectives that we had to retrieve from China after we recognized them? And that, I think, is where we fell short. We had no strategy, we had no tactics. It almost appeared as if we were recognizing China for the sake of recognition. And subsequently, of course, we progressively witnessed through the 1950s a deterioration in relations because China did not reciprocate that sentiment. Whereas we thought China would be a partner, China felt that they were the victors of the Second World War as the only Asian country in the Big Four, and that therefore they had the predominant role in shaping the world order, and that other countries, including India and Indonesia, should, in a sense, play second fiddle. And therefore, I think the two foreign policies did not quite mesh with each other, India's and China's, and it progressively led to the deterioration that eventually culminated in the border conflict.
In your sense, as a veteran diplomat, why do you think we rushed to recognize China?
Well, I think broadly because it has been a central part of Indian foreign policy to consider China as an important player in the region. Now, whether China is a friend or a challenge or an adversary, the centrality of China as one of the principal players has always remained a part of Indian foreign policy. The problem was on the other side. China did not give India that sort of equal status. China considered itself equal only to two countries, the United States and the Soviet Union, and its successor state, which is now the Russian Federation. All other countries, including India, were considered as adjunct powers. And therefore, we were treated not as an equal, but as a subsidiary power, which should accommodate China's concerns. But China did not feel that it needed to accommodate India's concerns to the same degree. So I think this mismatch between the two led to the problems which eventually, of course, led to a breakdown in the relationship. I do admit that with hindsight, it is easier to conclude such things. But there were certain pointers even in the 1950s which ought to have made us take a relook and adjust relations. We didn't do that. And one of the lessons, therefore, from the book I've written is to see where those pitfalls were and to see how we can avoid them.
Ambassador Gokhale, on that note, we'll take a short break. Don't go anywhere. This discussion on Ambassador Gokhale's new book, Crosswinds, continues on the other side, and we will look at India-China relations more closely in the current context, the economic slowdown in China, and the crisis in Taiwan as well. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to this special broadcast. You're watching our conversation with Vijay Gokhale, former ambassador to China and India's former foreign secretary, somebody who is an authority on China's role in geopolitics. And Ambassador Gokhale, we are discussing, your new book, Crosswinds. We were talking about Taiwan. You've analyzed the two crises in Taiwan Straits very closely. How worried are you about what's happening in Taiwan, looking at history, about what happened post the World War?
So I want to make 2 points, Parikshit. Firstly, of course, the Taiwan Strait is still perhaps the most dangerous conflict point in the Indo-Pacific even today, because the interests of the two major powers in the world, the United States of America and the People's Republic of China, are directly involved in this. Secondly, one of the main lessons of my book is that in the previous Taiwan Straits crises, 1954 and 1958, India did involve itself, not on the matter of sovereignty on who Taiwan belonged to, but because it was geopolitically important for India to ensure that there was no conflict in the Strait, and therefore India took initiatives to work towards bringing the two parties together or trying to resolve the issue. It's another matter that we were not successful. That is also discussed in the book. But the point is, what happened in the Taiwan Strait was India's business. Now it continues to be India's business today because it is not just geopolitically important, it is now geoeconomically important. 50% of India's trade passes through the Taiwan Strait. Much of our supply chain comes from China, Republic of Korea, Japan. All of them the goods pass through the Taiwan Straits. Our Silicon Valley connection through the submarine cables run through the Taiwan Straits. So it is going to have a huge impact on our economy if there is any kind of friction in the Taiwan Strait. And I want to be clear, I'm not talking of war. Even if China were to attempt a possible quarantine of the island, a partial blockade of the island, a missile demonstration off the coast of Taiwan into the Taiwan Strait, thereby disrupting all shipping and air services, this would have an impact on our economy. So the point I'm making is, it was our business, and it is our business when there is a state of tension in the Taiwan Strait and when the possibility of some form of conflict occurs, because it does have an impact on us.
Right. Master Gokhale, now taking a cue from Taiwan, we've had a border dispute with China for decades now. Galwan re-emphasized that things between India and China are not good. And even now, we've not really solved the problem completely, and we remain at the highest level of preparedness as far as troop deployment goes. What are some of the current challenges that you see for India vis-a-vis China, and certain gaps in our policy which you feel that urgently need to be plugged?
Let me begin by saying that Galwan is a very major turning point in our bilateral relationship, because our understanding until then was that we would follow the boundary settlement on a parallel track, together with the normalization of the rest of the relationship. And this was predicated on the understanding that until a solution is found to the boundary question, neither side would use force or threat of force. That regrettably, that understanding progressively deteriorated, not just because of Galwan, but several incidents that the Chinese attempted along the LAC beginning from 2013 onwards. And Galwan was in a sense a tipping point, because 20 of our brave soldiers were martyred in Galwan. Now, I think rightly the government's position now is that the boundary question has to come back to the center of the relationship, because the parallel track on which the two were running, boundary and normalization, are not running parallelly anymore. And therefore, if you see, the government's position is that the relationship will remain abnormal or in a state of tension until we resolve the remaining points. I'm not aware of the details, but whatever remaining points there are in East Ladakh. The other factor is that we are now in a state of armed coexistence. This is the fourth winter when we have a heavily, the troops are manning virtually the entire line of actual control, which means that deterrence has to be stepped up. And if you see the way in which government has acted over the last 4 or 5 years, we've built infrastructure, we've modernized equipment, we've reinforced troops and so on. The last part, however, is that we, in my own view, I think we need to, it's a question of walking on two legs. You have to deter, and we should not neglect deterrence, and it's very clear that the government is not neglecting deterrence. But we also have to have a dialogue, because ultimately matters get resolved through dialogue. If you see, just yesterday, a 2-day dialogue took place between the United States and China in Thailand, and they are, in a sense, they both see each other as an adversary. That has not stopped the dialogue. A number of our other partners have also spoken to China. I believe it's a matter of time before we will speak. It is for government to decide when to do so. But I feel that, you know, if you can, the approach should really be talk and deter. It's not an either or, I think it's both. And I'm quite confident that, if we are able to do that, we will sort of eventually prevail in whatever objectives the government has set in mind.
So you would possibly recommend that we should have a dialogue with China at the level of heads of government?
No, not at all. No. You see, a dialogue with heads of government comes towards the end of that process.
When you've solved something.
Yeah. Or when there's a certain amount of understanding is reached on various important issues. So that's the sort of end of the process. We already have a number of mechanisms in place, and it can be at the official level, it can be at a ministerial level, it can be through diverse mechanisms for which we already have agreements in place.
But we've already had a lot of dialogues at the NSA level, at the foreign minister's level. Do you think this issue has not been discussed in detail?
No, I'm sure it has been discussed. But to my understanding, there has been no direct bilateral visit by us to China since the Galwan incident took place. And if I can recall correctly, there's been just one visit from the Chinese side when I think their foreign minister came in March 2022. Now, given the fact that we are two large neighbors, two significant economies, two powerful militaries, this, to my mind, reflects it's an aberration, because for the last few decades we have had a fairly intensive political dialogue. It doesn't mean we have actually agreed on everything. It just means that the lines of communication have been open. Now, partly, of course, this was because of COVID. So it's not just India, China. We practically had no dialogue face-to-face with the rest of the world. But now that we've come out of COVID, I think perhaps it is time to see ways in which it has to be done. I mean, the modalities have to be worked out by the government. They are in the best position to take a decision on this.
Now, speaking about the Chinese economy, we are looking at slowdown in certain sectors of the economy. We have received news that a Hong Kong court has ordered the liquidation of Evergrande. What does this really mean for the Chinese economy? And when you have parts of the economy moving slowly, how do you expect Xi Jinping and the political leadership in China to act?
So let's first start by admitting that it has never been easy to make an assessment of the Chinese economy, because we are dealing with a country that is opaque in its provision of information to the rest of the world, critical data on which you analyze an economy. What is clear is there is a slowdown, and the slowdown is there for structural reasons. Now, you have different figures of the GDP. The Chinese Prime Minister in Davos talks of a 5.2% GDP growth this year. There are other well-known institutions in the West, institutions like the Rhodium Group, for instance, which place the growth at as low as 1.5%. So that's the range we are talking about. A few things are clear. Firstly, there is falling land sales revenue. This was the principal modality through which finances were raised by the state to build infrastructure. Now, because there is a surfeit of infrastructure, and because the property market has slowed down, you can't sell more and more land, and therefore revenue falls, and therefore the government feels, particularly local governments, feel constrained. The result is you're not going to have infrastructure-fueled growth anymore, which means you won't have these high double-digit growth figures and so on. Now, part of this problem is also because domestic consumption is not taking place. It's a country which consumes significantly less than what its GDP and what its exports ought to suggest. In fact, a number of reports suggest that it is compelled to export, primarily because the domestic consumption is low. Now, unless domestic consumption takes over some of that export gap, which is growing because countries are becoming protectionist, let's face that, you have another problem where there will be oversupply in China and not enough demand. So that's the second problem. A third is there is a fall in demography. Now, some of it is made up on the production side because nothing is labor intensive these days. We are getting more and more into mechanization and into robotization. So you make that up. But ultimately, there is a consumption side also. When population falls, I presume you expect consumption to fall as well. So there is no path to stimulating greater consumption. And I think all this has come together, which suggests to me that this sort of linear growth that we saw from 1990 until 2020 may be coming to an end. And the rest of the world needs to grapple with it. But having said that, Parikshit, let's also admit that we are talking of a $16 trillion real economy. This is a manufacturing economy. I am not one of those who subscribes, therefore, to what people call the coming collapse of China. This is going to remain a formidable economy for many years. We are plugged into that economy, as is the rest of the world. Any disruption that happens there, for whatever reason, internal stability, external conflict, is going to impact on us. A certain amount of de-risking or de-leverage is necessary, not just by us, but by the rest of the world. And I think our government has also taken steps. But it will remain a very significant economy and a major engine of growth, even at 2 to 3%, because we are looking at a base of 16, 17 or 18 trillion dollars in GDP.
So my final question would be the state of geopolitics we find ourselves in. You've got a war in Ukraine, you've got a war in the Middle East. How do you see the rise of China right now, the role of China in these wars, Russia and China coming together, and are we, or possibly could we be close to a third world war?
Oh, I don't think we are close to a third world war at all. But what I do think we are close to is a progressive disintegration of the post-Second World War order. The credibility of the United Nations is at its lowest, and you can see that in both Russia and in Gaza. Permanent members are involved in both conflicts, right? Which is odd, because the creation of the UN was that these countries should keep the peace, not go to war. The Bretton Woods institutions are relatively discredited because they don't give a voice to emerging economies, which has led the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, where China and India are the two largest investors. And technology itself, we are now seeing the downside of, whether it's climate change at one end or terrorism at the other, you're seeing. So I think we are seeing a disintegration of global order, and it's natural for a country of China's size and stature to try and take advantage of it, because it feels, and again, it's not a value judgment, it feels that the post-Second World War order was one which was wrought by the West. And therefore, we see the role that China is playing directly and indirectly in the Middle East, in bringing Saudi and Iran together, or in supporting Palestine, or in Russia and the Ukraine. But that having been said, I was struck by a very important news yesterday when the tanker was hit by a missile attack from the Houthis, and where the Indian Navy has come to the rescue. And the news report said, look, India has shown that it acts in a crisis. China has taken no steps to act in this crisis. And I think that too says it, that this is a country which may aspire to be a global power, but hasn't yet shown, hasn't taken the responsibility when it comes to regional conflicts to keep the peace. And I think all credit goes to us because we have done it, and so I think we just have to see where we go from here. But let me once again reiterate, I don't think we're close to a third world war.
All right, so that's good to hear, but you're saying that naturally this is a situation that China would like to take advantage of, and very uncertain times we're living in. Thank you very much, Ambassador Gokhale, for joining us on the program, giving us the lessons that we've learned from the post-Second World War scenario and what relevance they have even today. Thank you very much for joining us. That's all we have time for on this special broadcast. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.